You're on the Six Screens Telenetwork, earning the reputation of giving all the right ingredients, uninhibited in exposing the hard, cold facts about the Watchtower Society. And now, the Disney.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome into our six-screen Sunday programming. Now, we do something different here on Sunday. We get into spiritual matters. We get into what many Jehovah's Witnesses do for spirituality when they leave the Watchtower organization. And we discuss things that, can be very important in your life. Now, we have Chad Burns. He's out of Illinois, and he is an anti-Jehovah's Witness activist, and he wants to expose them, but he talks all about cults, and he wants you folks to be aware that there's still cults out there, and he examines them, and he researches them. And today he's going to be talking about the Reverend Applewhite. Oh, in fact, I've got some pictures, too, I'll be putting up for you, Chad. Give me about 2 or 3 minutes to do that after I talk to you. He'll be talking about Reverend Applewhite and how he got individuals, pretty smart kids, I'm sure you'll hear all about it from Chad, to join his cult. So, Chad, I'm going to step in the background, and I'm going to let you take it away, buddy.
All right. Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And today's program is, I have done research on this for the last 2 weeks. I have listened to over 30 hours of testimony from Heaven's Gate members. Some are still alive, some died. And just hearing their experiences in and out of the cult, everything that's happened to them, it has been shocking and it has been very revealing to me. I remember when Heaven's Gate happened. I remember that back in 1997. And, my life at the time, I was going through a lot of pain and agony, and there was, just a lot of crazy stuff going on. But I remember I was with my grandmother at the time, and we were watching the news all the time. And when Heaven's Gate happened and they found these 39 people dead, I looked at that and said, well, my life doesn't seem quite so bad. And, to get in the spirit of this, I have to admit, I started watching Star Trek: The Next Generation because I know they were big fans of Star Trek. And it has really helped me to get into their minds and see where they were coming from. And I have to admit, this cult, and it's sad, they were the largest mass suicide ever to happen on United States soil. For those who don't know, they were not specifically a religious cult per se, but rather they were a cult with religious and sociological aspects. Now, I wrote down 13 pages of notes, and some of the stuff I'm sure we're not even going to need and touch, but I did want to give some background because I remember when all this happened and listening to the news broadcasts and listening to testimonies. I only remembered bits and pieces of it, but I learned so much more than what was originally covered back in 1997. And I'm so glad that Rick asked me to start examining and exposing other cults, because it's really gotten me back into this research and stuff. And it's really just a passion of mine. And I've learned so much about Heaven's Gate. And I want to say this right now. The Heaven's Gate cult, in the cult itself is now defunct. It's no longer in existence, but it is. What I mean by that is membership is closed, but there is still, to this day, 4 living members who are still hardcore believers.
What?
It's very, very sad. Yes, caller, go ahead. Rick's got a phone call. Okay. So, yes, there are still 4 people. 2 of them are actually keeping the original website up and going. You can still go to heavensgate.com, which is their website, and they had a statement against suicide, but then they also have what they call an exit statement, which was their suicide, we're gonna get beamed up now type deal. This is absolutely shocking to me when I started digging into this. And I suppose our story really begins with Marshall Herf Applewhite. He was also called Doe. He was born on May 17th in 1931. His father was a Presbyterian pastor, a Presbyterian minister, and he was raised in a good, loving home. It was also strict but loving. It was a good balance there. But also, another thing about Herf was he had homosexual impulses, and he knew that went against the beliefs he was raised with. He knew that went against what his father stood for, and it caused a lot of issues. Now, Marshall, or Herf, he ended up getting married, and he had a very happy marriage, and he had a child, and he ended up teaching at the University of, I believe it was the University of Arizona, or it may have been, I'm sorry, it was the University of Alabama. And eventually he was caught having a sexual type relationship with one of his students because he was a teacher there in the music program. And this thing blew up on campus. You have and this was back, in the late 60s, early 70s, and it's just not good to have your professors sleeping with their students, let alone it being, a homosexual relationship. And he ended up losing his job over it. He had to kind of leave. And at this time, he also divorced his wife and left his child behind. And his child, I think, was like 6 or 7 years old. And he ended up moving to Texas. And while he was in Texas, that's where things started to happening. It was in 1970 that he joined the opera, and he ended up having a psychotic break, and they had to lock him up in a mental institution. So Herf Applewhite, he had a history of mental illness beforehand, and he went to this hospital, and he was supposed to be getting help, for these mental breakdowns he was having in these psychotic breaks. And it was in this hospital he met a nurse, and the nurse's name was Bonnie Nettles. Bonnie ended up recruiting him. People think that, Herf was the leader at the time of the Heaven's Gate suicide, and he was the main orchestrator. In reality, he wasn't. It was all Bonnie Nettles. And they came together. She was married at the time and had a daughter. And what ended up happening was they spent so much time together. When this mental break happened, that they ended up coming together. They were drawn to each other. She really recruited him to be her follower. And she was into theosophy, which I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about Gnosticism. She was into Gnosticism, but she was also into practicing the whole New Age movement, where you're talking about chakras and crystal power and pyramid power and all this kind of stuff. That's her background, and that's mixed in with first, second, third century Gnosticism. Now, this is really interesting because Herf, being brought up in a minister's home, he was used to spiritual things, and he was used to spiritual ideas, especially things related to Christianity. Now, Bonnie was opposed to Christianity, but she was not opposed to using Christianity to achieve her goals and the things that she wanted. And this was all towards, the end of the 60s and the early 70s. This is the whole drug culture and all that is going on. Now, as I mentioned, they spent all this time together. She recruited him, and originally they called themselves Bo and Peep. Like the children's story, Little Bo Peep. They called themselves Bo and Peep. And they ended up referring to themselves as the Two out of Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 14. It talks about two witnesses that are going to be on the earth during the tribulation period. And with Herf's background in Christianity, he had studied the end times from the perspective of amillennialism, which allows for a lot more spiritualization of the text and allegorical types of interpreting. So he didn't really have a good solid exegetical ground to stand on, and exegete means to bring out. He didn't have a good, strong discipline in hermeneutics, which, if you remember, that was one of the earlier things I had taught on previous programs. When I started with Theology Matters, I wanted to discuss hermeneutics and its importance. So this lack of good, solid hermeneutics left him vulnerable, and it allowed her to kind of introduce this idea that they are the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11. Also, the whole Star Trek TV series came out, and that was a huge, huge thing. Now, when they started, they had some pretty way out there beliefs and some pretty interesting goals. In 1973 is when they discovered they are the two witnesses. So it took about 3 years for them, or 3 years for Bonnie to divorce her husband, and for her and Herf to come together and unite and start this cult.
You better, because it can't get much worse.
And hi, Susan.
Hi.
They discovered they were going to be the two witnesses who were going to be martyred and resurrected and then ascend to heaven. And they reinterpreted that to return to space. So their view of resurrection and ascension was actually to die or to leave the physical vessel and then evolve into the next level of humanity. And this is where everything starts moving pretty quick, because it was in 1974 that they started out as the Crew. This time they were not known as Heaven's Gate. They were just called the Crew or the Class. And oftentimes, right up until, they all committed suicide, they were referring to themselves as a class, like a classroom. And they had elder members. And that's how Herf had, or Doe, that's how Doe had referred to himself. So they start the Crew. And what they want to do is shed their humanity and evolve to the next level. They always used the analogy of a caterpillar who would go into a chrysalis and emerge as a butterfly. And their view on it was that you actually reach the next level while you're alive, so that when you die, all you're doing is you're shedding your body, the earthly vessel, and you evolve to become an alien. Like I said, these guys were fans of Star Trek, the New Age movement, and they had some way out there beliefs. Now, in 1975, they start their recruiting efforts. And remember, I mentioned that whole Star Trek thing. If anyone remembers Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek, she was that beautiful black lady who was always on the bridge, and she was one of the main characters on Star Trek. Her in real life, now her name is Nichelle Nichols, and both with an N. Her brother joined this cult in 1975. They ended up using him to help gather other people. And I did want to give you an idea of what what Doe looked like, which is Marshall Applewhite. So, Rick, if you'd put up that first picture, I'd appreciate it. That is Marshall Herf Applewhite. I'm sure you guys remember him now when you look at his face. He's got kind of a blank deer in the headlight look in his eyes, and they're kind of wild, and it's crazy. And if you go to the next picture, Rick, what we're going to see is in this next one, we see another man with a very similar look on his face. And I think to everyone in the XJW community, they are going to recognize that as Stephen Lett. And yes, I did not even have to make that picture. I just typed in Marshall Applewhite, Stephen Lett, and that picture just popped right up in Google Images. So I was more than happy to include that. I thought that would be pretty interesting for everyone to get a look at. Not saying that, they're under the same influences. I think they have different influences, but I would definitely say they have a lot in common. I think they both were a few sandwiches short of a picnic. So I want to thank you for that, Rick, for putting that up for me. Let's see here. Now, early on, there was I'm going to go on a little bit here. Now, in April of 75, they were in Los Angeles, and they were holding some meetings. And in these meetings, they were able to gather some members. And I was able to track down one of the flyers that they used. Rick, if you could put up that flyer, I think it was the very next picture. But your phone's going, Rick. Anyway, it was in 1975 that they had gathered 25 members at a single time. And what they would do is they would pass out these flyers, and they would go to coffee houses and stuff like that, and New Age bookshops and occult bookshops, and they would advertise this, and they would say, oh, we're not a religious group. But in reality, they were just kind of treating religion as a buffet, picking and choosing what they wanted to believe in. And it was kind of a, smorgasbord where they just went and they used whatever they felt like using. And there was no absolutes in it other than what they wanted to be absolute. And that would have went directly against some of the teaching that Marshall Applewhite would have grown up with. Now, after this happened in September of 75, 20 more members were recruited. And each time when they had recruited some members, they would just vanish, disappear, fall off the face of the earth. No one could find them. They went completely underground. In reality, what they were doing was they were crossing the country, and they would stay in public campsites. They would be sleeping in tents and in the back of pickup trucks and station wagons, and they all traveled together. They ended up recruiting approximately 100 members, and they originally called themselves HIM, HIM, the Human Individual Metamorphosis, and that name was changed many, many times. And I do want to encourage anyone, if you want to call in and talk about any of this, please feel free. The phone number is 727-731-6701. Just hit *6 to unmute yourself. Now, also in 75, they began bringing in check partners. In other words, they would take two members of this cult, and maybe they didn't get along very well, and the ones who didn't get along would be paired up.
Hold on one second, Chad. All right. Sorry, just a little sound issue. Go ahead, Chad. Sorry.
All right. So these check partners were basically accountability partners, and they had these people who did not like each other.
Still on there with Chad, okay.
Yeah. They
All
had
right.
these people. Am I good to go?
Yeah, good to go. Yep.
All right. So they had these check partners, and they were people that didn't get along. They would partner them up, and the idea was it was their job to hold each other accountable. Now, remember, at this time, these people are not calling home. They're not writing letters home. And this check partner system was a way to exercise influence and control over the members, to get them used to not doing things that they want to do. It's a way for them to deny even just the most basic things, such as reaching out to your family. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. In 1975, there was a man named Hayden Hughes, and he was into the whole New Age stuff a little bit. And he was also a writer, and I think he was on the radio or something. But anyway, he was told that death can be overcame. And he said, we can overcome death just as Jesus did. We can evolve from a caterpillar to a butterfly, have a metamorphosis from a human level to a level above humanity. Now, here's the interesting part. He didn't necessarily buy into all of it. But he was told, if you ever want to contact us, and he was told this by T and Doe. He was told, if you ever want to contact us, use this secret code and we'll get back with you. This was the secret code. It was to pray to the two. Remember the two witnesses, T and Doe, Bo and Peep? The secret code was to pray to the two with the Lord's Prayer. Now, 15 months later, publicity happened in Oregon when people had joined and just disappeared. And Hayden Hughes realized, okay, this is that guy and that woman from 14, 15 months earlier. And he remembered what he said or what he was told. And that night he went to bed and he did exactly what he was told. He prayed to the two with the Lord's Prayer. The next morning, he got a phone call from him, from Marshall Applewhite and from Bonnie Nettles. thanking him for reaching out and contacting them the night before. Very freaky stuff going on. And I know a lot of people don't believe in supernatural stuff, but this is the world of the occult. And this is what the occult is like in many instances. So at this point, Hayden Hughes knows something is up, and they want him to join them, but he doesn't. He still stands back. Wow.
Also, go ahead, Chad. Just some issues here with some sound, but I think we got it under control now. Yep.
Okay. So that was in 1976 when he actually had prayed that prayer to the two, and he prayed the Lord's Prayer. You know, it was 15 months later. That show's very interesting. They were hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. Hayden was in Los Angeles. These people had just went missing from Oregon a day or two earlier. He prays that prayer at night. The next morning, he's getting a call from the two. So, of course, he's starting to buy into some of what's said. But when they started wanting him to spread the message, he didn't really get into that. He was actually freaked out by the whole incident a little bit. So then they ended up in 1977. They started adapting a more monastic lifestyle, you know, where they would kind of live in seclusion, kind of like in some of the older movies, they would picture monks living in a monastery. And that's what they did. Now, it's real interesting. At this time, they started developing a new language. And I'm going to share some of that language, but I want to point out why they did this. And they admitted this. This is important to know, and especially with the XJW community, I think you guys this is really going to resonate with you guys. They admitted that by changing a person's speech and the terms they used, they were changing the thought patterns of a human being. By changing the vocabulary a person uses, they're changing the thought pattern. Very interesting, because that's how mind control works, and that's how brainwashing works. So here's some of the language that they had introduced. The English word for mind, you know, like the brain, for them, they didn't use the word mind. They used the word computer. Instead of referencing genitalia on a human body, they called it the plumbing. Instead of having a body, they called it the vehicle. Instead of believing in heaven, they believed in next level. The house that they would live in, or the places they would stay, became crafts or spacecrafts. The kitchen became the neutral lab. The laundry room became the fiber lab. Money became known as sticks. Underwear was known as seat covers. Recipes became formulas. An office was known as the compu lab. The bedroom became known as rest chambers, or RC. The bathroom became known as bath chambers, BC. The living room became known as the meeting room, or MR. Sex became sensuality, or sensuous thought. Breakfast became first experiment. Lunch became known as second experiment. Dinner, guess what that was? Third experiment. That's what they called it. And then you didn't have a job. You had an out-of-craft task. You didn't have beliefs. You had programming. A woman didn't wear a bra. She wore a slingshot. There were not disembodied spirits. They were called influences or influencers, and also they were called boogers. I don't get that one, but whatever. They didn't go to bed. They called it going down. They did all this with the purpose that if you change the way a person communicates, you're going to change the way they think and change the way they register things in their mind. This was the beginning of the mind control. Also, they were encouraged to take new names. So they would take and choose 3 consonants for their names, and then they would add ODY to it. And Rick, if you'd put up the next picture, or actually it may have been even the last picture, it has the names on it. And just to give you an example, I really want you guys to see this, because this also establishes a hierarchy within this cult. Because there was one member, Chakotay, CHK, and then Odie being the family name, the last, what we would call a surname. Now, T and Doe did not have ODY put on their names. The reason for this is because they were already at a level higher than everyone else. And also that use of the ODY at the end was meant as a diminutive term. It was a way of saying, you have not arrived, you are not at our level, you poor thing, you're still a level lower, and you need to evolve further to catch up with us because you are inferior to us. That was how all that went. It meant they were on their way to the next level or to godhood because they had not reached it yet. They started to really push a desire for androgyny, and they standardized a dress code. They, in other words, they wanted it to where if you looked at one of them, you couldn't tell if it was a male or a female. You'd have to stare really hard or take a double look. They wanted to blend in with any kind of a group. This was very important to them, not to draw too much attention to themselves, not to glorify the flesh, or to do anything that would cause a person to have lustful thoughts. With the dress, it was always slacks and a button-up shirt, and it was always buttoned all the way up to the top. And then in 1978, this is a pivotal year when things really started to change. 2 members of the group came into some money. It was estimated to be over $500,000. So they started staying in large upscale suburban homes and mansions, 15 to 20 members living in a home. While the neighbors only thought there was 4 to 5 people living there, because they stayed in at all times, only went out when they had to, and they tried to make it so only a handful of people would go out regularly and be seen in the community and in that local neighborhood. So people had no idea there was like 25 people living in a house. They thought it was, 4 or 5 people. They kept up appearances. They ended up getting jobs and making money and all this. And they started reaching out and publishing flyers and having seminars. And it was at this time there was a member's mother. Her name was Nancy Brown. She started a newsletter for family members of cult members. So now, Applewhite and Nettles, all of a sudden, they're being stalked. And it's not in a malicious way. It was these people wanting to know, is my family okay? Are my children okay? And they were not allowed to have contact. So the crew, the leaders, T and Doe, they got very upset with this woman because she had started this newsletter and they wanted to know how she was getting some of the information. And even to this day, I don't think she's really disclosed a whole lot of it. I do think some, not all, but I think some of the information ended up coming from Bonnie's daughter, from T's daughter, that is. And we're going to talk more about that. But right now, I want to open up the phone line since we got about 20 minutes left. And I want to know, does anybody have any comments or thoughts, anything they want to share about this? Because, I mean, so far, this is starting to turn into a real sci-fi story. So, yeah, *6 if anyone wants to talk. If anyone wants to call in, the number is 727-731-6701. And I am going to just open up the chat. Okay. So, yeah.
Well, anyways, I'll kind of break the ice here for you, Chad. Well, what we've got here, again, is another cult. And cults, many of them, I mean, all of them really are about one thing, controlling one's mind. I see that's exactly what Applewhite was trying to do here with these people. He was getting involved in his cult. It's funny how people can just fall prey to this. And, of course, being on a program we're exposing the Watchtower, I'm not going to say that, they're totally similar, but there's certain traits that the cults have that manipulate you into thinking that, whoever their leader is telling them the God's honest truth. And people fall for this day in, day out. But that's the amazing thing about it. And I know as you continue to develop these cults, of course, we always want to keep Watchtower in mind. That the reason why we even bring these programs up is we're trying to make it known to the public that Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult too. They don't think they are. Hopefully they can see a connection when they hear about some of these other cults. So I just wanted to come in and say hello. And did you want other pictures up? You don't have pictures for today.
I think we got enough up for now.
All right.
I think
Okay.
we got enough for today. And there's someone in the chat, post-cult, the phone number for you to call in, I'm saying it too fast. Unfortunately, I can't type it in, but I can repeat it slower. And that phone number is area code 727-731-6701. I know you said you wanted to call in. That's 727-731-6701. And if you just let me know if you need me to repeat it again, I have no problem doing that. Or if Rick, if you could put it on the screen, that would help out too.
Yeah, we do have it up on the screen. Yep.
All right. Excellent. So, yeah, it's really interesting as I was studying all this. And I don't know if we have enough time. I think we might end up having to do a two-parter on this one because I'm like not even halfway through my notes yet. And I started writing really small at this point. But it was at this point that the cult was really developing and it was picking up speed. Remember that originally it started out in 1975 talking about aliens and you can reach the next level and we are just one form of consciousness and we can evolve like a caterpillar into a butterfly. Was there a caller that wanted to say something? Okay, guess not. So that's where it all started. And yes, that is the U.S. Post-cult hickey. So yeah, this is where it all started. And once they got people familiar with the ideas that were being presented, it never starts out, we want to control you. That comes later. It always starts out with a simple educational type format. We want to help you better yourself. We want to help you learn something. Think about it. That's the same thing the JWs do when they go and they go door to door, or when they do their letter writing campaign, or on the jw.org stickers. That's what it's all about. It's literally the exact same types of techniques that Heaven's Gate was using back in the 1970s. And they never went into detail publicly. It was once you joined, that is when they started bogging you down with commands. That's when they start bogging you down with, you have to do this, you can't do that. This is an improper thought. You shouldn't look at something that way. You should look at it this way. And it's not for any reason other than they want you to conform to what they are teaching. And they are going to begin teaching that they are the ultimate truth and no one else is right. They are infallible and no one else is able to give you instruction. And what that does is it ends up putting a burden of dependency upon the cult member so that they will depend on the cult leader. That's what it's all about. And by making this whole step of androgyny, where they're making everybody get a short haircut that's unisex, that could be worn by either a male or a female, now all of a sudden, they are stripping a person of their human identity. It says in the Bible, we're created in the image of God, and God created man in his image, and he created woman in his image. No longer, now they want everyone to conform and look the same, everyone to think the same, everyone to speak the same, everyone to behave the same. It's no longer about having, Christianity teaches we're one body, but with many different parts. It's not always that way in a cult. In most cults, they want you to be a carbon copy of everyone else, a cookie cutter, an exact representation. So one person is basically the same as another. There's no individuality allowed. And that is where this all stems from. This is where it all begins. So Nancy Brown, she started this whole newsletter. And yeah, Maverick makes a good point in the chat. Groupthink is slowly introduced until they hook you in. You're right. And then by the time they hook you in, you've swallowed that hook and you're not just going to get rid of it. You're stuck. It's like, you get stuck in the mud. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? And how many times? Now, this is the interesting part. With Heaven's Gate, they were really big, and I mean really big, on a person's free will. So they were always big on a person can come and go as they want. And that was absolutely true. During this entire time, people were coming and going. They were leaving the cult and coming back to the cult. And it was just in and out, back and forth the entire time. And there was nothing wrong with that. That's actually the way it should be. But here's the thing, it was that openness to them leaving. Oh, we're going to hate to see you go. Keep in touch. Make sure you drop us a letter. Keep us in touch. We want to hear from you. We still love you. That because they took that type of a approach, these people were more likely to come back or to send in money to help with the work that's being done. So that's one of the differences between the Watchtower's approach, where it's a hard line domineering control, versus the control that was being exercised in Heaven's Gate. Now, at this point, we're in 1978, and I talk about the two members. Okay, now here's the important thing, and this is a huge, huge, huge thing that happens. In November of 1978, Jonestown. Jim Jones led 923 people to their deaths. Some committed suicide. Some were murdered. Very sad when that happened. And I actually have the exact numbers here on that. Let's see here. It's on the first page, I believe. Yep. Okay, so 918 people died in Jonestown. 4 people died at the base headquarters in Georgetown. Both of those cities were in the country of Guyana, a communist country. So when all this broke in 1978, all of a sudden, people really started to hesitate when it came time to joining this group. And all of a sudden, people were finally open to hearing about the dangers of cults. So now all of a sudden, there's all this resistance building up. Now all of a sudden, the family members of cult members that are in Heaven's Gate are getting really scared, and they're getting really paranoid. And at this time, they start letting the people make phone calls home, just to check in, tell them, hey, we're all okay, everything's fine. However, what wasn't known is that the check partner was listening in on an extension. So that way they knew everything that was being said. They could be held accountable for it. So that way they wouldn't be pressured to listen to what the parents or family members were saying. And also there was a desire to protect the group, to show their loyalty and their solemnity with the group. They were solemn members, very truthful. So now all of a sudden, people are asking the question at their meeting, what's the difference between you and Jonestown? And people were asking this question. All of a sudden, they start getting very defensive. They end up having a really hard time trying to get new members to join. Then in 1982, 1983, Bonnie Nettles, the woman who started all this, she is secretly writing letters to her daughter, Terry. And in these letters, this is going to come up later on down the road, but it's very important. She was telling her to enjoy life, to get your education, be a productive member of society, have a family, do all this stuff that you want to do. And Terry found this to be a little bit strange because this group was very ascetic. In other words, it was very much about denying your desires, the things you want. It was about bringing. Yeah, go ahead, caller. Is there someone who wanted to say something? Okay, anyway, this whole idea of asceticism came in where it was, bring yourself under total control. And they were told to prepare for their graduation. And at this point, graduation didn't mean death. It just meant be prepared to get yourself prepared to evolve to next level. Now, in 1984, it's discovered that T has cancer and she's dying. That's Bonnie Nettles. Joe, which is Marshall Applewhite, he's left to run Heaven's Gate and to complete the mission all by himself. When she ended up dying June 19th of 1985, all the members were allowed to go home. In fact, all the members of Heaven's Gate were commanded, go home, see your families. And they were gone for a few weeks. And during this time, Marshall was trying to figure out what to do because now his older member, which was T, Bonnie Nettles, she's dead. And now he inherits control of this cult because up until now, she was the one pulling all the strings. She was the main puppet master and he was the primary puppet. Now he has to do it all himself. And remember, they met in a mental hospital. He's mentally unstable. So anyway, all these members get to go home after 10 years of almost no contact with the family. Very limited to a few postcards, a few phone calls. For 10 years, that's it. All of a sudden, they're all allowed to go home. At the end of it, when it was time for them to return back to the cult, every single one of them, except for one, returned to the cult. Only one person, after this 2-3 week period at home, stayed behind and left the cult. And even then, they'd never had a single negative thing to say about it. And of course, running short on time. I'm going to have to pick this up again in 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, we're going to look at some of the other things that happened and what really triggered the suicide. It's really interesting. It's when it's going to start getting really deep, really dangerous, really dark. So I don't know if there's anybody else who has anything to say. You're more than welcome. Hit *6. And post cult, if you would email Rick, you're in the UK. He has an app that you can put on your phone that will allow you to call into the show. Just email Rick. His email is jwworldnews@gmail.com. And he'll help you out with the app. And if you'd just like to drop me an email, my email address is masterslanterns@gmail.com. That's all one word, masterslanterns@gmail.com. So yeah, I think that is about all I have for this week. But in 2 weeks, I'll be back. And in 2 weeks, we're going to get down to the nitty gritty. And we're going to see how all of this starts to, yes, that is exactly it, post-cult. masterslanterns@gmail.com. That is exactly it. Feel free to drop me an email. But yeah, in 2 weeks, we're going to be looking, and this is where it starts really snowballing. This is all moving very slow, and it was all about just having control over people. Bonnie Nettles was very narcissistic. She thought so much of herself, even though she acted like she didn't. And when she dies, now all of a sudden, a man with some severe mental health issues is left to run the life of a cult and all of its members. This is where it starts getting really dangerous, because he becomes the ultimate authority figure for this cult behavior and pattern of belief. And now people start coming and going faster and slower. You have groups of people leaving and not coming back. And when you do have a group that leaves, you might only have a couple that come back. And it's becoming very hard to recruit new members. This is where it starts to really break down. And it becomes really interesting. So anyway, guys, I am Chad Burns. This has been Cracking Cult Codes. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I'll be back here in 2 weeks at 12 Eastern, 11 Central. That's U.S. time. And until then, just remember to live long and prosper.
Well, thank you very much, Chad. We appreciate you coming on and doing the program. We really, really appreciate it. Friends, we've got a lot more programming coming up today. You don't want to leave us now. We've got a great program coming up here next, as well as for the rest of the afternoon. Of course, when you're on the Six Screen Sunday edition, you're going to find that we get into theological discussion. We get into spirituality and what really goes on when a person leaves the Watchtower. What spiritual condition, what would be the journey for the future? So we're going to be talking about that today. We got a number of great programs. We got the Knowing God program coming up next. They're going to be talking about these other two Christian apologists. They're going to be talking about salvation. Once you gain salvation, can you lose it? Well, that's a good discussion. And then at 2 o'clock, we've got a program with Anne Marie coming in from Northern California. And the name of the program is Ex-Jehovah's Witnesses Share Their Spiritual Journey After Leaving the Watchtower. Now, we have got a man coming in today. He's an ex-Jehovah's Witness from Washington State. And he never did quite become a Christian, but he's going to give us some thoughts and share his feelings with us on that program at 2 o'clock. And then at 3 o'clock, we got a brand new program. We have got a woman coming out of the northeastern part of the United States. Her name is Sheila, and she's got a program debuting today at 3 o'clock here on the Six Screens Network. And the name of the program is The Truth Shall Set You Free. And she has got a guest coming on that is a real crackerjack ex-Jehovah's Witness when it comes to Jehovah's Witness doctrine. He's El Primo. So he'll be coming on today at 3 o'clock. And then 4 o'clock, we got the premiere program on the Six Screens, The Christian Court. Now, you don't want to miss it. We got some questions that will be answered by our scholars, and we're looking forward to that program. So join us for the Christian Court at 4, and then at 5. If you get some Bible questions you want to ask to Jay Hess, he'll be on answering Bible questions. He's a great guy. He has a real lot of knowledge about the Bible. So join us at 4 o'clock, Making Disciples with Jay. We're going to end this program right now. So we're going to end that, which we're doing.